honourable member from Edmonton-Riverview.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today and give my response to the speech from the throne. Of course, it was delivered on March 22nd by the Lieutenant Governor of Alberta. And I must say that I was most surprised by what the speech did not contain as opposed to what it did. And I guess the significant pieces that were missing for me were why I fundamentally became involved in politics. And it seemed like the speech from the throne was silent on many issues that I think are so important to the province of Alberta. Of course, I'm talking about fairness and justice. I'm talking about structural social services. Those matters were glanced at in the speech from the throne. It was disturbing to sit there and have those fundamental parts of a healthy society missing. And so I feel I want to take this time to address that and talk about the very fundamental importance of having structural social services in our province. And of course, I'm coming from the vantage point of 30 years as a social worker. So I'm a trained social worker. I worked frontline social work for many, many years. And so, you know, it is even more disturbing because of my educational background. So, but I think what's important too is just my experience as, you know, a human being in this province, growing up in this province. And I grew up in a small town in the Peace Country, Valley View. And really my experience as a child motivated me to become a social worker and then ultimately a politician, because social work had its limits. I couldn't do as much as I wanted to. I didn't have as much authority or power. So I sort of unwillingly, but eventually did decide to step forward and become a politician and a social worker. I'm still a registered social worker in this province and a very, very, very proud one. So I grew up in a very small town, 1,200 people when I lived there, and it was an oil town. And so I grew up in a town that, you know, had a lot of problems. It had high rates of addiction and violence. There still is and was at that time an Indian reserve right next to it, Sturgeon Lake Indian Band. There was a tremendous amount of violence on the reserve, lots of problems, lots of racism, anger between the two communities. And you know, I remember people saying, well, we have such a large RCMP detachment here because it's a great training place because there was so much violence and so much difficulty. There's also a whole bunch of sexism in my town. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with my mom and her friend, and she was talking about, she worked for an oil company, and she was talking about how she got half the wages of a male doing exactly the same job. And granted, you know, I'm almost 60 years old. This was a while ago. But that's what I grew up. That shaped my view as a young girl, shaped my view as a woman, and motivated me to do a lot of what I have done in my life. Another thing that really motivated me too is I remember in grade 6, right now at Sturgeon Lake does have their own school. And kids from the Sturgeon Lake Indian Band do go to school on reserve. But when I was a kid, they came to town. They were bussed in because there was no school on reserve. And I can remember my best friend in grade 6 was Verlene Gaucher. And she was a great gal. We had lots of fun together. And then we were all going to grade 7 at Hillside High School. But you know, Verlene never came. And she wasn't alone. There was many Indigenous children that never even made the transition to junior high. So besides sexism, racism, violence, addiction issues rampant, you know, in the community that I grew up in, I just thought, oh my goodness, there needs to be something better. Why isn't anybody fixing this? I can remember that as a young kid, you know, wondering what's going on, what's happening in this province. So this, I don't know, mythological Alberta advantage was never visited on me or my community, really. So when people talk about the Alberta advantage, I think, wow, you live in a completely different world than I ever lived in. And, and I'm going to just throw in a few social work words that I think other professions use too, so hopefully I don't lose anybody in that. But I'm sort of talking about the larger societal context right now, the macro, right? So besides sort of these challenges in the community that I grew up in, there was also micro challenges or micro systems that happen. And so then you're looking at the individual, you're looking at the family system. And so I grew up in a family, an intact family system, and I have, there's 3 kids, mom and dad, and both my parents had mental health issues. And consequently, because of that, specifically my father, he would self-medicate, and so he would drink excessively. So he had addiction issues. And of course, that caused a lot of issues for the family that I grew up in. I love, my dad's 90. He's an amazing man, and I love him deeply, but he had tremendous problems. And because of that, he had difficulty, earning an income, supporting our family. And so we had challenges in our family system. And my mom was a school teacher, and she had a stable income, which she was part of a union, so her earnings were protected. She had holidays, she had all sorts of support. So our family, was definitely a middle-class family, but we had many, many challenges. And I just always remember as a kid thinking, why isn't someone helping us? What's going on here? So I'm just sort of giving you the macro, and this is the micro, sort of view of the way I grew up and what sort of formed me and motivated me to do what I've done. So I really saw social work as the pathway to actually creating a better society. And, all these years later, I'm so proud of my profession and believe that it really fundamentally makes a difference in people's lives. And there's lots of barriers to social workers making changes in our system, and maybe I'll talk a little bit about that. But I guess one of the ways I kind of like to, because I taught social policy for years at university, and one of the best ways for me to help my students understand sort of the things that we need to do and the fairness and justice, how we need to do it, is just by telling a little bit of a story. So I'm going to tell a little story. So let's just use the North Saskatchewan, because here we are in Edmonton. So I'm walking down the North Saskatchewan River, the river's flowing by me, and it's a beautiful sunny day, probably a day just like today, because today is a magnificent day. And so we're walking along, and I'm just looking at the sun, and I'm looking at the birds and enjoying my walk. And then all of a sudden I hear someone yell, "Help, help, help, I'm drowning, help." And I'm like, what? And I look over, sure enough, someone is flailing in the water. So I run over, and I'm able to catch them and pull them out and save them. And they're so grateful. They're so grateful to me. They're just like, "Oh, you saved my life. I'm so lucky you walked by. Thank you so much for saving me." And so I just say, "Are you all right? Is everything okay?" Blah, blah, blah. They're fine. And so they just walk on their way. And I think, wow, I'm so glad I was there to help them. And then I just think, oh, what should I do? I'll just keep walking on my walk. So I'm walking along on my walk, and then not very much longer, again, there's someone, same situation. Someone's drowning. They're yelling, "Help, help, help, I'm drowning." And so I go over, and once again, I pull them out of the water. I save them again, and I'm like, "Are you all right? What happened?" "Oh, they're fine." And, they're just grateful, of course, that I'm there to help them again. And I'm like, whoa, what are the chances of that? That's so bizarre, But I'm glad I was here and I could help them. What should I do? So I'm going to go for another walk. I'm just going to keep going. Why not? It's a nice day. So I go again, and then again. Someone's yelling at me. They're saying, help, help, I'm drowning. You know what I do this time? I don't go save them. I go run upstream and find out who's pushing them in. So that's the difference between, doing sort of a charity model of social programs where you just give people things, you save them, or you actually change the fundamental roots of inequality and injustice. And of course, that's not true. I happily will go save that person. Of course, if someone's hungry, absolutely you feed them. You do both. You don't do one or the other. But a healthy society, and certainly Canada and Alberta, with our tremendous riches, you absolutely change the fundamental structure to create equality. We know societies that have equality, don't have so much disparity in income, are much, much healthier than societies with a big difference. That's why that's fundamental. So certainly, that really illustrates what, governments, what we must do as politicians. In my value system, where I believe people are equal, people deserve supports, people, like I talked about in my member statement yesterday, when I was a young single mom, I didn't have hardly any money, and I was going back to university to study. I had children. At that time, and this was, as I said, many, many years ago, there was support for me to be able to live in subsidized housing so I could better myself. And, as I said then, and I'll say again now, I've been a good investment. I've certainly paid taxes for many, many years. I've got a good income, like the rest of you here. And I've been able to support my children also to grow into adults and be successful. So I think that it's just that, the throne speech, it talks about charity. It doesn't talk about fundamental social justice. And, that really makes me concerned. Maybe I'll just talk a little bit more about that distinction between charity and justice. So charity provides direct services like food, clothing, shelter. Justice promotes social change in institutions or political structures. Charity is directed at the effects of injustice, its symptoms. Justice transforms systems by alleviating root causes of injustice. And as I said before, when I was telling that story, we need both. We can't just, leave people hungry or homeless. We need to do both, but we need to do things to change our system. So I just want to quote a little bit from a paper I was reading that talks about just the shortcomings of charity and why, even though the throne speech talks about charity and sort of seems to suggest that that's the way to go, it's really not. It's not enough. It does provide some relief, but there needs to be so much more. So this article is by David Pfirmer, and it's from, it's called Evidence Network. So charity is simply not enough. Citizens for Public Justice propose an impressive 6-point plan. It could nudge the government in several worthwhile directions, including indexing the child tax benefit. And that's something that when the NDP government was in, we created an Alberta child tax benefit. And these are the core root things that we need to do. Provide more safe and affordable housing. Well, as the former Minister of Seniors and Housing, we invested $1.2 billion. That was unprecedented in this province. That was 4 times more than the previous Conservative government inputted. We made homes for thousands of people so they could live in dignity. He also talks about establishing a national pharmacare program, providing improved access to skills, training, and funding for Indigenous education. Certainly this is actions that we took, and a national childcare program. Will everybody